Welcome back to another episode of the Royal Palace Podcast. I'm joined by Liam and our friend Sam to talk about the plausibility of European defense.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk of stall and surrender.
All scientists dying on purpose. The cultural soul demands.
You Americans have given us the sense was very easy.
Make our planet great again.
Hey everyone, and welcome back, Sam. Thanks for coming on.
Hello.
Sam knows way more about this subject than either Patrick and I do. This is, I admit, very much one of my blind spots is defense in general, and it's Sam's whole thing. He spends hours poring over this stuff inexplicably.
I'm obsessed. I'm waging battles in my mind constantly. Strategic situations are constantly evolving in my mind palace. And I'm obsessed with war. I can't get enough of it. I see it when I close my eyes.
Sam is currently consulting for both the Russian and Ukrainian governments, actually.
Gotta hedge your bets.
So the reason I suggested this topic was because, in Europe, we're hearing a lot about how we can no longer rely on the United States for Europe's defense objectives, especially given the Russia threat. Or the supposed Russia threat. But I wonder, and this is, I think, the core of this episode, I wonder whether or not it's even plausible from like a material perspective, but also a strategic perspective, for Europe to actually assume a sovereign and leading role in their own defense. Because, for a long time they've relied on the NATO Atlanticist structure, and notably the Americans spending the vast majority of money. I mean, the U.S. spends 30% of, on a global level, the U.S. is 37%, I think, of defense spending globally.
The U.S. spends an unbelievable amount, almost $1 trillion a year on defense. It sort of dwarfs any other country, including our enemies, rivals in Russia or China. But let's start by talking about European defense, because as I think everyone knows, Western Europe especially, has basically, its defense has been fully subsumed mostly into NATO and US hegemony since the Second World War. But it wasn't always the case that European defense spending and the state of European armies was very low. In fact, during the Cold War, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, actually, European militaries were, for obvious reasons, quite large, even though there were a lot of American troops and American defense umbrella over Europe. There was still a lot of European defense spending. German defense spending was over 4% for all of the 60s, which is 4% of GDP, which is quite high. But that's basically changed since the end of the Cold War, right, Sam?
Right. So you've had lower budgets, and at the same time, you have had, as technology has gotten more sophisticated, higher unit cost for most types of weapon systems, from individual arms and even uniforms and protective equipment, up to really sophisticated stuff like fighter jets and aircraft. Modern aircraft now cost just astronomically more than anything that was in production during the Cold War, just because of the sophistication of the electronics, the introduction of stealth, and also because you're purchasing smaller numbers, so you can't have large-scale line production the way you used to, so your unit cost is a lot higher. And so when you've got smaller purchases with smaller budgets, of high unit costs, obviously that's going to impact the defense industrial base substantially. And so you've had production capacity decline at the same time you've had the size and combat power of European militaries decline. And so the question now is, can Europe claw its way back to the defense industrial golden age of 1975, and is it desirable to do so?
Yeah, and this is obviously coming, as Patrick said, at a time when everyone is sort of worried or or not worried, if you're me, about the U.S. forces leaving Europe, which doesn't seem imminently possible, but obviously it's something Trump has threatened repeatedly because he's been saying since his first term that European NATO members are not pulling their weight, which in a sense is kind of true. NATO's spending target has been 2% of GDP. And do you know what the US spends?
3.4%.
Which is, I think, higher than any EU NATO member except for Poland. And many spend substantially less than that. Notably, Germany, Spain, Italy. These countries have all, you could say from a Trumpist perspective, taken advantage of the American defense umbrella and the fact that does Germany really need to be worried about getting invaded by anyone when it has 35,000 American troops stationed in it? Probably not. And so in a sense, Trump has a point there.
Right. You've really seen, in the last couple of decades, and part of this is due to the integrated structure of NATO, that European militaries are, on paper, really less capable. I would say probably aside from France, and if we want to talk about the UK, even though it's not in the EU, France and the UK are probably the only EU countries that could independently project force on their own. Like, if a situation emerged, they could fly in an air mobile brigade or ship it there and have it operate and be able to keep it supplied. And they wouldn't have an easy time doing that, to be clear. But they're the only ones who really have any experience doing that. France, because it's gotten into a number of tangles in its former African colonies in the past decade. Other than that, you don't really have any EU countries that are actively involved in any sort of military operations outside of certain UN missions, like the Italians in Lebanon. But you look at certain countries. Like, if you look at smaller countries like the Netherlands, that basically have lost their tank arm entirely because of smaller defense budgets. All the Dutch armored units have now been actually folded in with the German army into combined brigades.
Which, man, have you told some Dutch people in the 50s that was going to happen? They would be horrified.
Would be fainting. Yes.
Can I ask you for a minute about France? Because France has always been the exception to this rule to a large extent, right? France has always prided themselves since World War II in their military, in being the strongest military in the EU, much more so than Germany. Obviously, also having nuclear weapons. France and the UK are the only nuclear-armed states in Europe, in the EU. Obviously, Russia also is. But France has a much more comprehensive nuclear program, a much bigger one, and that can be deployed in multiple different ways, unlike the UK, which I think can currently just be launched from submarines, the Trident program. So. And France was always in NATO, but it was kept at NATO at an arm's length since our great friend, the General de Gaulle, withdrew from NATO command structures and forced NATO headquarters to move out of France and into Belgium, and refused any permanent American military presence in France. That changed in 2009 when our not good friend Nicolas Sarkozy returned France to NATO integrated command. But it's still the case that France has, as you said, an independent military force and a one that has some degree of strategic and operational separation from NATO command structures, from American command structures, in a way that the Netherlands does not. But has France's military also had its forces, its capabilities degraded since the end of the Cold War?
Oh, 100%.
Real quick, just interrupt. Liam, you mentioned the different ways you can launch nuclear weapons. And Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, but France no longer has the nuclear triad, right?
I believe, well, they don't have silos anymore. And I think that France retired all of the ground-based systems that they planned to use to basically glass West Germany in the event of a Soviet invasion, which is really cool that was the strategy for all that time. but France is actually expanding its air-launched cruise missile capacity. They're actually reactivating a number of air bases in the northeast of France that were retired after the end of the Cold War, with that specific capacity in mind. And France is also modernizing and expanding its nuclear submarine fleet. So they've got two legs of the triad, and arguably the ground-based component of the triad. That's like to get don't want to get too into the weeds of nuclear war fighting, but for a long time it's been debated whether that's still a relevant capability.
Because you can actually know where the silos are, where submarines, right? You can't.
Right.
It's feasible that they're undetectable.
Yeah,
right?
unless you get into all sorts of like quirky stuff like the Soviets were doing with like disguising them on rail cars and things like that. And for France, it was always mostly a mobile system that was relatively more portable. In any case, I think the silos were shut down quite some time ago, even during the Cold War, because France is frankly too small of a territory to mask that sort of thing. Unless they were sticking them out in like Guyana or something, which seems like something they would do, but I couldn't tell you. So
Yeah, what I see here, just doing a quick Google search, it looks like 1996 was the last one that was
okay,
closed.
interesting. But yeah, France on the whole, I mean, had an enormous military standing army in the Cold War, and that was possible because of conscription, largely. But they used to have a very large force that was permanently stationed in their occupation zone in Germany, the French Army of the Rhine, which was would have been composed of, I think, the First and Fifth Armies during the Cold War. They used to have a number of standing heavy armored divisions, which were largely staffed by conscripts, and then they would have the smaller air mobile elements that would be used to deploy to hotspots in Africa or elsewhere in the world. And since the end of the Cold War, without conscription, with rising costs of maintaining that structure, basically the heavy component of the military has atrophied substantially in order for them to maintain that smaller, lighter professional corps that can be used to quickly respond to emergencies abroad, basically. So now we're starting to see a push in the other direction of bringing back a force that's capable of fighting a peer competitor, because we're all about peer warfare now with what's going on in Ukraine. And the French, interestingly, have been studying that very closely and have really been rolling out drones in large numbers and trying to integrate that technology at a low level. So there's a lot going on there, but the numbers are nothing like what they were in the 80s and 90s, and never will be, if we're being honest.
Can you explain that term, peer warfare?
That's to say, like, red team and blue team, and they've got basically the same capabilities, which is to say, like a type of war that no Western country has fought since I don't know when. I don't know how far back do you have to go for that.
Whereas 20 years ago, everyone was pivoting their militaries to be toward, asymmetrical warfare.
Yeah, permanent counterinsurgency. Yes, because history was over and there was never going to be a real war again. It was just every once in a while you have to go and beat up on some insurgent movement in Africa or the Middle East.
But now we're back.
Throwing the reverse lever. Because you either have to prepare for Red Storm rising in Eastern Europe as the Russian armored columns pour over the border, or the American-led Endsieg versus China. So
when we talk about like the plausibility of European defense, right? We've mentioned a little bit about like having weapons and stockpiles ready, but what about the actual manufacturing and producing, purchasing, procuring of those stockpiles? Because my understanding is some people want to just ban. I don't see this as realistic. You can tell me what you think, but just not procuring from the U.S. Anymore. I don't really see that as plausible. But my understanding is that like even when European countries buy Europe-made material, they're often still buying products that have like American components in them. So, like a quote here I found is that like the Eurofighter is about 25% American components. The Swedish Gripen is 40%. So, what does it look? What is Europe's ability to even manufacture the weapons they want to procure?
right. So the core of that is first looking at what's happened to the European defense industrial base. So if you look at like total EU military spending, if you add all the EU 27 countries together, that comes out to, in 2024, 326 billion euros. So something like maybe a third of what the US spends. And then imagine dividing that 27 different ways. Um, Up until recently, countries have not put a high emphasis on EU procurement unless it was for the benefit of their own defense industry. And so what this really means is that only, like, you've had France with its couple large firms, Dassault and Nexter, for instance, Germany with Rheinmetall and KMW, Italy with Leonardo, and then all the UK firms, which up until recently were involved in all of that. And they have protected their own national champions, basically, whereas other countries have generally gone for the lowest unit cost, which is always going to be the US, because the US has the largest economy of scale. So yeah, you had a growing number of US and other foreign systems. The Poles in particular have spent an enormous money buying arms from South Korea in terms of tanks and artillery systems. Obviously, you've had the F-35 has become now the predominant fifth generation aircraft. Outside of France, I don't think that any of the EU countries are producing aircraft domestically. There's the FCAS program, which is Franco-German, maybe Spanish now. I can't remember if they're in it or not, but that's still 15 or 20 years out. And there's just other capacity too, where there's very heavy dependence on the US in terms of, for instance, satellites. EU and no EU country has a comparable surveillance capacity. So that's another major point. So it is funny that the EU's ambition to Europeanize defense spending immediately threw Marco Rubio into a foaming at the mouth panic the other week. But it does seem that they're a long way from being able to do any of that. Some core systems could be ramped up in terms of tanks, in terms of infantry equipment. There's been a major effort in ammunition production and artillery systems because of the war in Ukraine. The EU has been pumping a lot of money into that and has managed to put together centralized procurement, effectively trying to get all of these countries to bulk order together instead of frittering away money in 27 different ways. But that's when you start to get into the internal divides, and countries that consider themselves frontline countries, like Poland, being in proximity to Russia and Belarus, argue that they need weapons right now. They can't wait to develop a European production capacity for them. They need to get the best systems at the best price. They want to continue to buy from the US and South Korea. The Netherlands is in the same boat, not because they have any urgent need, but just because they don't want to spend money on it. So they're like, let's buy the cheapest thing from the Americans, regardless of our industrial sovereignty. And that's a major divide to overcome. And you've got other countries, too, that are just very defensive about their own industrial base. And the Italians, for instance, have, on several instances, refused to play ball in terms of building a European defense economy instead of national ones. They've obstructed a number of different mergers involving the French company Safran, for instance, which produces jet engines, among other things. And they haven't shown a lot of interest in. For them, it seems as if it's not really a big difference if they're backing an EU company rather than a US one in their defense procurement, unless that production line is in Italy. And that's not to, obviously I'm a admitted Francophile and Gaullist, but the French have also been very defensive about this, with Macron moving to protect a naval group and other French shipbuilders from Italian purchase in the last couple years. So the French are not immune from their own nationalist sniping. And if we're being honest, a big part of their push for Europeanization, aside from their long-term vision of European sovereignty, is because they think they can be one of the biggest countries to profit from that. France has moved up, it should be acknowledged. They're now the world's second largest dealer of arms after the US. That's mostly because Russia has stopped selling due to the war in Ukraine. But France right now is in a very profitable position, selling fighter jets and artillery systems. So
Not going so great with submarines, though.
yes, well, now Australia's regretting that choice.
Yes,
They're
which
trying
is
to sell
very
to
funny.
Canada now. So
The French make an equivalent to the Patriot air defense system, right?
I believe they make the missiles. I don't know that they have the same capability in terms of the radars and the launch system. And that just shows that, like you were saying, this stuff has all gotten so interwoven now. It's really fascinating. And I saw some discussion, and I wish I'd saved the article. But there's a question: it's like, would a European fighter would it still be dependent on American munitions? Because it's not clear that in terms of guided missiles, that at least not without UK participation, that the EU has the technology base there. They have Thales in France, but certain systems are specialized. It's interesting that you mentioned also. I would throw in to highlight the Gripen, the Swedish fighter. That has actually started to ring some alarms for Europe on this topic, and it's one of the things pushing the Europeanization, indigenization movement here, is that there was an effort to sell the Gripen to Colombia, and the Colombian Air Force was basically weighing that versus the F-16, and the Trump administration has now signaled that they're prepared to use ITAR, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, basically U.S. technology export controls to prevent the sale of the Gripen to Colombia because the engine components largely are U.S. made. So they're basically a strong arm the Colombians into buying the F-16 over the Gripen. And, the U.S. having that veto capacity is something that's a little bit concerning if you're in the EU. And a lot of countries have explicitly, a lot of foreign ministers have explicitly pointed out the position that Ukraine is in, being completely dependent on Western supplies, and especially the US for certain precision systems like the HIMARS, that basically Western countries and the US can withhold those arms from Ukraine if Ukraine is not behaving in a way that pleases them. And so there's a concern that the EU could find itself in the same situation at the large scale. And there's a lot of whispering about whether the F-35 has a kill switch, so there is a sovereignty argument to be made there.
Right. These, as Trump said, it's all computer.
Yeah, all computer, all cyber.
You can see why people are starting to freak out about this, because despite how committedly, the top brass of all European countries and most European countries has been committedly Atlanticist forever. But for the first time since the Second World War, I think people are finally starting to take seriously the possibility that the US isn't an ally that Europe can always rely on. Like the idea that the U.S. could at some point be not an enemy, but not an ally that we can depend on for everything here is being taken as a real possibility for the first time. And without them, they've also got 100,000 plus troops still in Europe.
For how long?
Yeah, but let's talk about the different outlooks on this by the different European countries. You were just talking about Italy. They're one of the big players, but what about Poland? What about Spain?
Right. So what we kind of alluded to there is that Poland is in a funny position, and I think, like you are saying, I don't think that Poland's leadership is prepared to really believe that the transatlantic era can end. Poland has, since it freed itself from the yoke of the Warsaw Pact, or however you want to phrase that, has done its best to buddy up to the US and play the good deputy in Eastern Europe, signing up for Iraq too when most European countries didn't want to, buying an enormous quantity of American arms. Probably, I would be curious. I need to actually check the numbers on this. Poland is probably the US's single best customer in Europe in terms of arms sales, in terms of tank systems, aircraft. I would bet if you total all of that up, probably more sales to Poland than any other country. And all of that is fueled by the ancestral fear of the Russian bear to the east. And Poland considers itself, I guess, a frontier outpost, and has a national nightmare of being partitioned again. And so they will continue to be one of the leading spenders on defense in Europe. And they've been very aggressive for years, pushing other European countries to spend more. but whether they actually are interested in that spending coming to anything at the European level, I think is less certain. Um, I think Poland's main push on defense spending has been they like to couch it in the burden sharing thing where that U.S. politicians like to talk about of Europe taking advantage. The Poles like to be like, no, no, we're not taking advantage. We're the good soldier over here, and everybody else should be too. So that we can, have an enormous stockpile of missiles and also keep however many U.S. tank divisions on our soil.
Yeah, the poor Poles, they never get the mega credit that they should get. Hungary gets all the Republican attention.
No, I mean, under the last, they probably renamed it now, but under the prior extreme right government in Poland, they built a U.S. military, a base that was meant to be used by the U.S. military in eastern Poland that they were going to name Fort Trump. I assume that they renamed that now. But yeah, Poland has been the ultimate American kiss up in Europe for 30 years, and it must be heartbreaking for them to see how little goodwill it's purchased them in Washington.
So what about Spain, one of the other major European economies?
Spain, the fastest growing European economy, unless I'm wrong, right? I'd have to check that again.
Yeah.
But
at least last year, fastest growing Western country.
How the tables have turned on stagnant and deindustrializing Germany. Who's lazy now?
Yeah, the Spain, Poland, Lithuania are currently the three, basically only three EU countries that are doing well in terms of growth. The three amigos.
Pedro Sanchez is promising to channel that growth into a Spanish military renaissance.
Thank God.
As Spain has been, if you want to look at it in terms of percentage of GDP, Spain has been apparently rock bottom in NATO spending for a while, something like 1.2% of GDP going into defense. So the Spanish army is not in such a great state in terms, much like Germany, a situation they've been in, a lot of deferred maintenance, a lot of equipment that doesn't work as well as it should. So he has promised to raise spending up to that much talked about 2% target, but it's unclear exactly how. And part of that seems to be that he seems to want to count a lot of other crisis spending as defense spending. He's pitched the idea that spending on climate change mitigation is a defense issue. So maybe the plan is to fudge the numbers there enough to get to a 2% measurable.
I fully support it if that's what he's doing. I think the problem here in Spain, where I live, not actually in France for listeners, and for Catalan listeners, I do not live in Spain. I'm sorry for saying that. I live in Catalonia. But I think the problem here is that if you look at the opinion polls, like support for NATO is very low in Spain, and people being worried or caring about Ukraine and Russia is also very low in Spain. Part of which is obviously geographically. We feel so far away from Ukraine here, and we're a peninsula with a mountain range. Like, just the idea of anyone militarily threatening Spain feels very improbable to most people.
That's a really great bridge, because I think that's what we're going to get to next, is like the strategic coherence of Europeanization. But I think Spain is in the same situation as a few other countries. I'd point to maybe Greece, certainly Portugal, in terms of the threat not feeling immediate, and in terms of difficulty in pushing through any sort of spending increases, because I think you could characterize the Spanish government for us in a moment, probably in terms of the hurdles that Sanchez would have to deal with to actually push through increases in defense spending. But my understanding is he can't work with either the left or the right there. And that's probably, we should also touch on Italy real quick after this, because they also have a fun political hang-up.
I wanted to interject to say that you mentioned Greece, though, and actually, at least in 2023, Greece was by percentage of GDP, the second largest spender on military in Europe, except for Poland. But it's about Turkey, right? It's not about Ukraine at all.
That's right. That has nothing to do with Ukraine.
They could actually see themselves in a war, but it would be with another NATO member state.
Well, I don't know about Greece, but I also wonder if they have a similar situation to like the gendarmerie in France, where you might have people counted as being part of the military who are actually police officers in effect.
Yeah, that's true. Like in France, where one of the major police forces is technically part of the military, as you said, the gendarmerie. Here in Spain, we have the Guardia Civil, which is also, it was modeled after the gendarmerie. So I don't know how I don't. Do you know how that's counted in the French budget, Sam? If that's counted as a military expenditure?
It's definitely. It's because it's funded through that ministry.
Because they do military functions as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you become like they have military ranks and everything, and if you join the gendarmerie, you could find yourself on the side of a highway pulling people over for speeding, or you could have been sent over to an African nation doing spec ops.
Well, they do military police. What's done by military police in the U.S., but I think it's a pretty separate division, right? I feel like.
Yeah, and they don't have a civilian function. Like U.S. military police can't stop you on a highway. It's just mostly to prevent anybody on a military base from selling too much methamphetamine. So.
No, but I mean, I think that's a pretty separate organizationally within the gendarmerie. The part that's doing civilian, the part that's doing military stuff.
Yes, but also if you join the gendarmerie, I don't believe you have a choice, and they can move you between like local law enforcement and deployment on will. And they train they train on like military weapons and stuff, even if they're going to be just a highway cop.
That's something at some point we'll do an episode about French police, because I think the existence of the gendarmerie, of like military policing for civilians, is quite foreign and scary for Americans.
Quite common in many other places.
Even though in France, I feel like those are actually kind of the good cops, because they're the guys who make sure no tractors are speeding on country roads. They're not like because they have no jurisdiction or they don't operate usually in urban areas.
And they were sidelined during the Vichy regime because they were seen as kind of potential source of opposition, while the Police Nationale, the urban police force that we'll talk about more on another episode, was created under the fascist regime.
Yeah. Opposite of the case in Spain, where the Guardia Civil, the military police, are strongly associated with the fascist regime. And they didn't change them much after that, except getting rid of their stupid hats. The classic stupid. Anyway, that's a tangent. Back to, you were going to say something about Italy, right, Sam?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there we go. Italy with the Carabinieri to continue on the gendarmerie track. And maybe that'd be a funny way to hit the 2% spending.
That's a much better transition. You're much better at this than we are.
We're gonna put a military policeman on every street corner in Europe to hit our 2% defense obligation. Would be a fun trick here.
I will say, if Sanchez is just using accounting trickery to increase defense spending, I fully support that. The U.S. is not going to notice. I mean, come on, you think?
Nah, they're not going to come over and take account of how many bullets and bombs they've got stacked up. But
they'll just ask ChatGPT or Grok.
Italy is in a fun situation too, though, of despite being a coalition of the far right rather than a coalition of the left, they've been walking a funny line rhetorically, where Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, has discovered that the European Union is very happy to let you just run a fascist, homophobic government in Europe, as long as you make vague noises about NATO and your support for Ukraine. But she's run into the problem that the actual, pro-fascist, the most hardline pro-fascist parts of her coalition don't really like Ukraine and are pretty indifferent about NATO, at least now that it doesn't seem to be running stay-behind networks in their own country anymore. The funny thing is, one of the major schemes that the EU has been pushing to increase their defense spending is basically saying that if you increase your defense spending up to a certain threshold, if you raise your spending by up to 1.5% of GDP per year for the next 4 years, which is crazy to think that they're opening the door for countries to boost their defense spending by 6% of GDP on top of existing spending, which would put them well over any reasonable threshold. Russia right now, being on a war footing, is spending up to 7% of GDP, according to some estimates. But yeah, they're basically saying if you increase by that amount, it won't count against your debt limit at the European level, and they won't hold it against you. And what's fun is that Italy has been pushing this measure for some years now, because Italy, even though it's not a huge spender, still throws some money around in some domains. They're one of the, aside from France, I think the only European country that still has almost aircraft carriers. Like, they aren't really, but they sort of are, because every once in a while Italy likes to go and poke around at the Hornet's Nest in North Africa and in Lebanon. So it's still, in the Mediterranean, the Italian Navy is at least substantial.
Italy has a history of throughout the Cold War, sort of keeping a slight distance from the U.S. or from the complete U.S. military agenda in the way that that West Germany or Spain or the UK did. Like Italy throughout the Cold War kind of tried to chart a middle path, partially because of how strong the Communist Party was there.
And they had a strategic situation that allowed them to do so.
Yeah, even though they have so many American troops in the country. What was it called? The Sigonella crisis?
Oh, I don't think I'm familiar.
There was, when was this? 1985? There was like almost a shootout between Delta Force and Italian soldiers. It was crazy.
Awesome.
If you don't know, go read about that. If you don't know about it, I don't know the details, but it's insane confrontation under Bettino-Craxi.
That's beautiful.
How about when the Americans in our northern Italy air base cut a cable car line by flying too low?
Oh God, that was horrible. It's crazy that there isn't a bigger popular movement to kick us off of all these places.
There was. That's the thing. There used to be, and it used to be 10 years ago, 20 years ago, until about 10 or 15 years ago. There was very much an active debate in many countries, especially France, Spain, Italy, many other countries, about NATO. Like there was, historically most left-wing parties, most center-left parties were opposed to the membership of their countries in NATO. I mean, and obviously this peaked, with the Iraq War and so on. And the reason is obvious, but that has sort of almost completely disappeared from the political discourse. There is such unification behind NATO now, even with Trump.
Yeah.
No one's saying, no mainstream politician is saying that any country should leave NATO. In fact, they're all fucking joining.
Right.
Well, and just on a kind of side note, it's true that European leaders are certainly talking about how their distaste for the US at this moment, and I certainly know a lot of people who are like, oh, we can't trust the US anymore or whatever. But just when I meet random people today, I've had multiple interactions in the last 3 weeks where French people find out I'm American, and they're just like, I love the US. It's so great. Why are you not there now? And I'm like, have you not heard what's going on?
That has not been happening to me lately. That is not what happens to me when I say I'm American.
Point for Barcelona.
Literally yesterday, this guy was like, dude, I went to New York 10 years ago on a trip. I loved it. It was amazing. I want to go back. Why are you here? You should go back to New York or whatever. I'm like,
there's something sick in France. Now, I went to a party a couple of weeks ago where I didn't know most of the people there, and I came in and someone asked me where I'm from, and I said American, and his face just immediately contorted into a look of disgust, and then he tried to recover from it, but I was I agree. I mean, correct response.
Yeah.
I had a guy 2 weeks ago tell me, I was like, oh, I don't know, things aren't going so well, I guess, over there, I mentioned that I had a friend who, because of Trump, got lost his job. It's Sam for listeners. And
thank you.
And he said, yeah, but you guys elected him, and he didn't seem to have a problem with Trump. And this guy wasn't white, okay? And I'm just like, what? Where do you guys get your new, it's they haven't even heard of it, anything that's happening. I don't know how, but
that's strange. That is very much not what I've been encountering.
When I got admitted to the hospital a month ago, so the lady at the desk was probably from an Eastern European country, and she's like, why are you here? America, so great. And I'm just like, what? Maybe it's just where I live in Paris.
This again happened to me before Trump, but is very much fallen off now. And I think the polls show this too. I saw a graph recently of European tourists to the US. Everyone's canceling their trips. I know some people here who canceled their trip to the US because they're all worried about being, randomly arrested and tortured at the border.
Fair enough. I mean,
fair concern.
This is the problem with the European mind, and it's what we touched on before. Is too many of them are reluctant to abandon their naive preconceptions. Too many of them want to believe we're going to go back to the beautiful, never-ending 1990s of the benign American hegemonic influence, and at the governmental level. It was amazing to see and frustrating to see, the panic that was created by Trump 1 in 2016, and you had the same flurry where we're like, oh, Europe needs to get serious about we need to prepare for a post-American future. And then they were so happy to all climb back aboard for 4 years under Biden. Just like, oh, problem solved. Nothing to worry about ever
I
again.
think the same thing happened before that with Iraq, in Bush. There was a similar kind of thing, and then it all bends back into Obama. It seems to be impossible to destroy especially the European elites' love for the U.S.
Because it's very comfortable for if you're the German chancellor to just not have to have a foreign
That's true,
policy,
and it's sort of like it's a lot chiller than being like the head of a fully sovereign country. There's a lot of things you don't have to worry about because you can't control it.
Think of all the things Macron would not have said if he was the guy who would push the button. Like when he was like, "Oh, we're going to put troops in Ukraine or whatever." Like he gets to just say that stuff because everyone knows like it's the US is at the helm.
Well, the French president has always had license to do that. It's just kind of expected that you're going to cosplay as a great power if you're France. So
it's funny. It makes me think. I've had friends in Eastern Europe tell me semi-seriously that they'd rather that their country's troops be under American control because they don't really like trust their own governments, which is understandable. Actually, if you look at some of those governments, like, do I want the Polish state to have more power in general? I mean,
right. And the related note, and it sort of goes back to how we were talking about the heavy U.S. military presence in Italy. And it's like, well, let's look at why that is. It's because of force projection. It's because Italy, you have proximity to all Middle East and North Africa, so we have these giant air bases there. We have a major combatant command centered in Naples. But this goes back to, and why it's very hypocritical for all these U.S. presidents, and Obama did this too. That's the thing. It's very much the Trump thing of hammering about the lazy European freeloaders, but Obama did the same thing. And it's hypocritical because this dependence on the US is something that was cultivated very intentionally in the late 80s and early 90s while the Cold War was winding down. Under Bush 2 and under Clinton, there was a real concern that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the end of the Warsaw Pact, that NATO was going to fall into disuse or that countries were just going to leave, that the whole thing might cease to exist. And as you were saying, Liam, there used to be a serious political faction in Europe that would have been fine with that. And it was something that was openly discussed. Do we still need NATO now that there's not a major geopolitical competitor
when
in
NATO
Europe?
became synonymous with offensive things, like the bombing, like
Exactly.
Serbia,
But even
prior to that, yes.
Well, that is true. That is true. That was happening concurrently. So that is true. And so there was a major push by Bush 1 and by Clinton to get these Eastern Europeans in as quickly as possible to try to find a reason for NATO to exist, which is part of why Serbia happened, because it's like we can say, well, now NATO is a humanitarian actor. We intervene in crisis situations, et cetera, et cetera. But something to try to justify it because they identified that with the end of the Soviet Union, the US's main geopolitical interest was now the Middle East and protecting access to oil. And to do that, you need bases from which you could project forces into that region, which means we need to maintain our Air Force bases in Germany, in Italy, to be able to have the strike capacity and the airlift capacity to quickly move troops there, to move weapons to Israel, for instance, all of this. And so there was a great effort to keep NATO alive with that in mind. And to that end, they you could say that the European countries sort of lulled into strategic sleep, into this dependence because it served American interests. And it's funny that now that history is restarted again, that's a problem. And now the lazy Europeans need to spend more, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. It's funny because that was never the U.S. position. Like the U.S. obviously very happy with this, because it means effective American control over European foreign policy, European military policy.
Exactly.
And I do want to highlight that I feel like it often gets overlooked in the history of this, that these or just sort of American strategic control over Europe like this descends directly from the American occupation of Germany and Italy. And Germany and Italy are still the two largest deployments of American troops in Europe and the center of American command, and not just for European stuff, but also, as you said, for all this Middle Eastern stuff, for Iraq and everything. Both the German bases and the Italian bases and the Spanish bases were crucial. And those troops are just like, in a sense, those are the occupation troops that never left. Yes, it's true that those countries never demanded that American troops leave, but they also never assented to it. And obviously, I'm not saying that it was bad that the U.S. invaded Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, but it's still like, as modern states, they have never not been under. I mean, American occupation might sound like a strong word, but it does mean that if it sort of implicitly restricts your sovereignty, because it implicitly restricts what you can do, They've never had any problem with this because German foreign policy since World War II has never been at odds with American foreign policy. But it also never really could be, or it could never go too far in that direction, because there's 35,000 American troops stationed on German soil.
Right. And it's very revealing, Rubio's freak out about the idea that Europe might impose restrictions on how this new military funding could be spent, that you can't just hand it over to U.S. companies. Because, and this has been the case every time, that there's been a demand for more military spending from Europe, and then anytime anyone proposes that means that Europe needs to become more autonomous or to manufacture those systems itself, there's an outcry from the US. Because the idea that Europe might not be completely joined at the hip to the US strategically, Europe might be able to speak up or object or pursue its own aims, well, that is completely the opposite of what the US wants. So
yeah. I said, no, you misunderstood me when I said that you should develop your own military capacity more. No, I just mean you should give me more money. You should subsidize. Exactly. Ideally, we should have American troops in Europe, and the Europeans should somehow be paying for that. They want to have their cake and eat it too.
The worst possible direction this was going was what was happening under late Obama, and then what resurfaced again under Biden was a push by some Atlanticists, some really vocal people in Brussels, that the best way to keep the U.S. on side is to go in on this anti-China thing with them, and to start getting NATO involved in the Pacific, and to start looking at how do we cooperate with Japan and South Korea and all of this, because that would have, even more than currently, that would have just made NATO completely just an extension of the U.S. in all domains around the world. Not just an instrument of American control over Europe, but now a way of, forcing the Europeans into something that geopolitically is not relevant to them at all. And the good news is that under Trump, that's now too toxic. It won't happen. But
true, but it sort of effectively has been the case for a while that, obviously Japan and South Korea and the Philippines aren't NATO, but given that NATO is, for a lot of intents and purposes, the U.S., I think you can sort of see it as all one blob. And again, those are all countries that were also occupied by the U.S. It's just, I think despite how much the European Atlanticists want NATO to be something else, you can't extricate it from what it is and its history, which is American hegemony that was imposed by force on the rest of the world. And a consent in those countries, in the countries where it operates, that is achieved by initially by force, obviously, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Italy, but today just by, manufactured consent, the deep way that the political and media elites of all those countries have been for decades embedded in the American Atlanticist machine. There's just so much machinery to make this happen. And it is fascinating seeing what's happening now, that it's, someone is taking a huge sledgehammer to that machinery, and it's cracking, but it's cracking in weird ways, and it's not cracking as much as it should. There's so many people in Europe who are, and not ordinary people, but these Atlanticist elites who are in Berlin, in London, who are still just insisting that this isn't happening. It's fascinating.
Well, and just kind of on this vein of the difference between the elites and what everyone else is thinking. I was looking at trying to gauge popular support for the Ukraine war, right? Because it's the Russia threat that's kind of implicitly here as why you would want one of the reasons that Europe thinks it needs its own defense. I mean, it's clear that in countries like in Poland, the Baltic countries, in Finland, that Russia is like seen as the threat for them in terms of security. But if you look at like France, I found one survey that says Russia's like the sixth, or seen as the sixth most concern for French.
Did
for
they just
French
pick
people.
like every Muslim country they could think of to go in front of that? Or
Well, so
what?
this survey said, this survey was doing for example, number one was radical Islamic terrorism. So France is still kind of in a GWAT logic. Mass migration as a result of war or climate change.
Oh, Christ.
Climate change generally, extreme weather and forest fires, racism and other discrimination, and then finally Russia. And that's true for Germany too. Like Russia barely, it's I believe sixth as well. So all this defense stuff is kind of being justified on something that clearly not a lot. And we see this on the far right, especially, right? Like the far right generally seems to be the only outlet for people who are not supporting the Ukraine war, or the political outlet for not supporting the Ukraine war. So what are we defending against?
Oui, d'accord. Oui, d'accord. Oui, d'accord.
In every poll about support for NATO, support for Ukraine, so on, which I think has sort of become synonymous recently, since 2022, we see that there's like extreme regional divergences in concern across Europe. Like, for example, I was in Lithuania recently, and I was shocked there by how much just there's still like support for Ukraine stuff everywhere. Like Ukraine flags, the buses like keep flashing "We love Ukraine" in between flashing the destination they're going to. It's kind of like Paris was, or the US was a bit, like right after the invasion happened, but isn't really the case anymore. It's like, it's very much not like an active concern anymore. I think everywhere in Europe, people were like, in France in 2022, people were like, oh my God, there's going to be nuclear war with Russia imminently. And now it's sort of just faded in largely into the background as the sort of thing that's just going on. Obviously a horrific thing, but not something where like people in most places in Europe actually think that Russia is going to overrun Europe with tanks in the matter of weeks, especially because they were unable to overrun like the most dysfunctional country in the world in several years. However, what you see when you look at these polls is that there is great concern about Russia, a broad war with Russia that still exists in some very specific places, which is the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Finland, and to some extent also the other Nordic countries. And then you got like the least concern in Southern Europe, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, Portugal, even Southeastern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, people don't care. Hungary, they actually would embrace a Russian invasion. It's interesting, and it does, what people were saying that I was talking to in Lithuania, people there are actually very concerned about a Russian invasion being imminent. And people there, when I was there like a month ago, were saying that the end of the Ukraine war would make them more concerned because they think that would then mean that Russia's no longer tied up and could immediately divert all their forces to seizing the Baltic countries. And on the one hand, I get the concern because those are like very small countries and they're geographically isolated from the rest of Europe. Like there's a small border between Lithuania and Poland. What is that called? It's what these people talking about a Russian invasion are always talking about.
The Suwalki Gap.
The Suwalki Gap, yeah, which is like between Kaliningrad, which is a Russian exclave on the Baltic, and Belarus. There's this little gap. This is the border of Poland and Lithuania. And so people say, oh, Russia would seize that in 24 hours, and then the Baltics would be completely cut off and be completely vulnerable. The case for how Russia would invade Finland and why feels a lot less plausible to me. But my point is, I kind of get in those countries, it makes sense why they're so much more concerned about this and why it feels like a more immediate issue for me. And as I was saying before, in Spain, I mean, it's like path out what a Russian invasion that would reach Spain would look like.
By then, the world has already ended. By then, as I think the main idea is that if they have reached the English Channel, probably cities have ceased to exist by now. So most
Right.
likely. So it does seem like a more remote concern.
But obviously, what people who support NATO and support European, or European unified defense, obviously they're different things. People kind of think about it in a similar way, I think, in Western Europe or in Southern Europe, is that they obviously wouldn't say that Spain is, except for the most hysterical people, would not say that Madrid is going to have a nuclear bomb dropped on it. But they would say, but if Lithuania was invaded and we did nothing, then that would completely undermine the whole premise of European defense and of NATO and of, Europe.
Yeah. Deterrence in general.
Yeah. But would people care? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the interesting question. And what you'd look at is, NATO, with this in mind, has self-consciously put what have been referred to as tripwire forces in the Baltic. The idea being that if you put a bunch of foreign troops there, then there's certainly no backing out if Russia comes in and starts killing them. Recently, Germany actually is I forget if it's a brigade sized formation or what, but it's the first permanent foreign deployment of German troops, I think, since World War II. I forget if it's Lithuania or Latvia.
Love to see it.
Yeah. But it's an interesting question for the idea of both NATO credibility in terms of what exists now, or more prospectively, European defense credibility is what happens if, and it doesn't really matter the intention, if Putin rolls into Estonia and Latvia and tries to seize the capital, because certainly Russian troops have occupied a Estonia and Latvia sized area in Ukraine, I would think. Certainly the capacity exists to do it. So what happens then if he does, I guess?
And I think a lot of people and the governments of those countries are concerned that, barring the current presence of American troops there, nothing would happen. And it's very debatable, but it is definitely true that it is not at all comparable to how people would feel if Hawaii got invaded or something like this, or some Alaskan islands. It's like, in a sense, why would you care if you're 4,000 miles away on the East Coast? But also, everyone would obviously care a lot. And it's definitely not the case that Europeans think of the EU in that way. They don't think of these I don't know what percentage of EU citizens could accurately say which is Lithuania, which is Latvia, and which is Estonia, but I'd be surprised if it was a majority.
I'm curious about that. I think obviously there's, very much a self-consciously European ruling class almost everywhere.
Yes.
I don't think that outside of Hungary, there is a government in Europe that would decline to become involved in this case. Italy is the only other question mark, and I think even then, I think that they would, because they basically have gone along with the transatlantic consensus until now, and I think the actual invasion of an EU country, which triggers a defense clause in the European Union founding documents as well as the NATO Article 5, I think basically it's a done deal. And I think it's been set up. They've done their best to make it so that there is no decision to be made. Obviously, that's a self-conscious effort by NATO and by the European Union also.
Yeah, I just kind of wonder. So I feel that the European defense promise has always been kind of based off of NATO and the US acting as a deterrent for Russia, right? But in a world in which the US isn't a deterrent, I mean, I certainly believe that you're probably right that a lot of European countries would react if they cross that red line, if you will. But if it is, a symmetric war where if it escalates to that, where we're looking at, the kind of combat that you're seeing in Ukraine, is the EU ready for that? Or are European countries ready for that? Are populations willing to accept that? I mean, we, especially in the West, have been used to the GWAT logic where we can just send airplanes. Like, I don't know. Do you see it as plausible to have like an actual Europe, like, can EU member states mount a land war, a grueling land war?
It wouldn't just be EU member states; that would be the US too. Obviously, there are American troops in those countries.
But it's worth, for our purposes, it's
Right.
worth
No, but I mean,
considering
in the
both scenarios.
plausibility of European defense, right? We're removing the U.S. element here. I believe this works with the U.S. element, but if we remove it, is the EU really as or are EU member states, especially the Western ones? I'm thinking France and Germany. Are they really willing to mount a land war?
Well, let's forget about willing, because we're talking about such a hypothetical scenario where the U.S. is gone for some reason. But are they capable? And I think that the idea of a Russian invasion of any EU state is absurd. But let's say the U.S. is gone tomorrow and Russia invades EU territory. What does that look like militarily? Can France and Germany and let's say the UK too actually compete with the Russian war machine on their own?
Right. It's an interesting question. I think if you look at the raw numbers of vehicles, of troops, certainly the EU, taken all together, spends significantly more than Russia, almost double right now. Although, if you adjust for purchasing power parity, it's probably actually close to being the same, according to some measurements at least. And it's hard to account, you kind of have to put on a timeline. If you're accounting for Russia's losses in Ukraine, how long does it take them to get back to being fully capable as they once were? Russia, on paper, has 3 times as many tanks as the EU, but that takes into account a lot of older hardware in stock. Similar ratio for artillery, which has become the big thing in Ukraine in terms of firepower superiority. Rough parity in terms of aircraft, with most of the European planes probably being somewhat more modern. But part of what we were talking about, and part of where earlier when we're talking about capacity and where the EU is dependent on the US, is sort of the softer elements in terms of logistics, for example. There's really no other country on Earth that can move material around the way that the US can in terms of having cargo aircraft and the ability to quickly do that. And so you have to kind of suspect that in my scenario, if this Baltic scenario happened, you have whatever European like quick response forces are already there, and how long can they hold out? And probably until they run out of ammunition. And then how long does it actually take to be able to mobilize and then move reinforcements there? By then, it's a done deal. And so the question is the EU, is a European military effort, whether it's combined or a coalition or whatever, are they willing to launch a counteroffensive to retake the Baltic states? That's kind of a different question. And do they have the material wherewithal to fight a drawn out war in the style of what's going on in Ukraine? In that case, right now, it seems like certainly Russia has mobilized their defense space to be able to fight something like that, to churn out enough ammunition to keep fighting that over a long period. And I suspect that as things stand, the EU could sustain that for a few weeks if the political will existed. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
It wouldn't end with, Berlin or Paris is seized by Russia, right? It would more be possibly the Baltics, possibly Finland would be undefendable.
Right. I mean, my assumption is yes, because again, we saw the way in 2022 that the Russian invasion of Ukraine petered out, that just the way the balance of technology is such that defenders have so many ways to slow down and inflict attrition on an attacking force, especially now. Just infantry units have so many different means to destroy tanks, especially in obstructed terrain in cities and forests, etc., that with the element of surprise, which is overwhelming material superiority, sure, you would expect the Russians to probably be able to blitz down through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There's just nothing you can do. And then eventually they're going to hit this culminating point where momentum runs out. But reversing those gains is not easy for the same reasons. So.
Right, and you mentioned like the difference in material production. Well, from what I've read, at least, like Russia currently is manufacturing more artillery shells than the U.S. and the EU combined, and
Right.
like the Russians have at least the ability to move their forces via rail, or their tanks and whatnot via rail pretty close to these countries. Whereas my understanding, at least, is that like there's a huge logistical problem in just getting tanks from Germany to the Baltics, because of the deterioration of the old rail networks that used to connect.
Yeah. Also, the Baltics and Finland use Russian gauge. Gauge, for any non-rail nerds listening, is like the distance between the two tracks for railway, and there are different distances, and obviously they're not. The same train can't run on all of them because the wheels are at a fixed distance. And there's a Russian gauge, which is different than European gauge, and the Baltic states use that. So does Finland. So I think there would just be a problem like that. Trains can't go from Poland to like this. A train can't go all the way from Germany to the Baltic states just because the type of track switches, which they're currently like. There's this largely EU funded project called Rail Baltica to build high speed rail between the three capitals of the Baltic states, and then to connect to Warsaw. And lately they've been trying to justify this for defense reasons, because it's going to be built in European gauge and not Russian gauge. But this wouldn't obviously be built until the 2030s, I believe. Which is, by the way, disturbing to me that people are talking about planning for infinite conflict with Russia so far out. Surely the goal should be that we don't have another Cold War, and that we
I'm very much into Maginot Line logic. Like if you really think a war is coming, focus really on building actual defense, as opposed to trying to have an offense. But I don't know. I can't imagine a European conflict like that anyway.
So I think once you kind of play this out in your head and try to roll through this scenario, and you look at like the balance of forces, and you start looking at those industrial questions, I mean, you can see where if you accept that this is a possible scenario, you can see where like the terror and where the concern comes from if you're a European policymaker. So the question then is what's your more workable pathway? And you can see why there is still a strong loyalty to the Atlanticist current if you are in this Baltic area, if for certain countries in the EU, and you can also see why there is a real urgency behind those who are pushing for a more sovereign European approach too. I think, and so the question is really what's workable, what's possible. I guess that's up to the listener to decide.
We talked a lot about Russia, mostly about Russia here, for obviously good reason. That's where the war is, and they're also the only major military, quote unquote, theoretically hostile major military power that's close to Europe. But when we talk about European defense, when people are talking about this, are they thinking of any other threats?
I think there's a conscious desire to avoid talking about anything else, because it's really clear that only France, and then if you want to be generous, you throw in the UK, are interested in the idea of external application of force, of having expeditionary capacity. And even in those countries, that's not really popular outside of the policy making class, so to say, right? As soon as I think you even begin to entertain that possibility, any sort of consensus you have breaks down, right? You can't find any German that really wants to go along with that, or any Pole that's interested in that idea if the US isn't the one driving it, I think.
Yeah, and any other sort of regional threats, putting aside like the idea of expeditionary force against China, in an invasion of Taiwan scenario, which I agree. I mean, who would get behind that? 100% the UK would jump behind that just because they love being subservient to the US. But otherwise, like the idea that a unified European military would participate like in something like that is absurd.
The idea of doing anything more than, like, I think of after the Bataclan attacks in, was that 2015, I think, that Francois Hollande just went and had the French Air Force drop a bunch of bombs on, what was it, Raqqa in Syria, and said, well, we sure showed them. That is, I think, the absolute extent of what your typical European voter is willing to tolerate in terms of expeditionary activity, right?
Yeah. And then if you're talking about any other regional threats, it's kind of hard to think any of, like, in that way, the EU is sort of geographically blessed in a sense, especially now that, one thing that the past 70 years have accomplished is that the idea of there being a war between France and Germany or any other European power like that is unthinkable. And then otherwise you have, like, Egypt, Morocco, like, obviously no concern there. The only other country that could plausibly have a war with a European state is, as I said before, Turkey, which with Greece and Cyprus, and Turkey's a NATO member and a very important one. And so that's something no one wants to talk about, although it would be a fascinating scenario. I guess we sort of already saw what happens when Turkey invaded in the 70s, invaded Cyprus, and well, that was pre-EU, but still the answer was everyone just decided to say, let's just ignore that happened and not talk about that again.
That's inconvenient.
Yeah, and it's still inconvenient to talk about that.
Or one of the things I think people think about when they think about this defense buildup in the US, but also a bit in the EU, is kind of this idea of like some sort of military Keynesianism, where they think this will somehow be... I mean, do you guys get the sense that people somehow think this will be the way Europe finally rediscovers growth, or do you think that's not on their radar in the same way it is in the US?
It's what the German government thinks.
Yeah.
The Germans kind of need anything that they imagine will allow them to keep a factory open at this point, so...
Yeah, and one of the things I think of is like, well, like World War II obviously was... brought a lot of wealth to the United States. It, brought in the era of mass production, and it allowed us to live, consumer lifestyles that were pretty great. But do you think it's actually plausible that can happen here? Because the thing I notice is that, Germany has been living under grueling austerity and trying to impose it on the rest of Europe for what, the last 30 years. And they haven't been willing to spend money on infrastructure or social programs during that time, and now they're suddenly willing to break their golden rule of spending, their budget cap, and now they're spending it all on defense. But is it going to actually bring any good for European citizens?
What I would say about that is, sorry, before you respond, Sam, is twofold. One is that it's been often pointed out that sort of fiscal, economic industrial stimulus only works if you're making sure that this spending goes towards European factories, which is what the US does. The US doesn't import a lot of foreign arms, and it doesn't seem like there seems to be too big of a ramp up with not enough industrial policy. It's not at all convincing that that's what's going to happen from what I've seen. And then secondly is that American prosperity is to a large extent based on the military industrial complex. Like, not just in a sense of that we loot foreign countries, but also just that, like, the American economic model is built on just so much constant government money pumping, especially into various remote rural areas. These shipyards and stuff are sort of deliberately spread out throughout the country. Part of this just happens because of how the American political system works, where a senator can be like, I'll only vote for this if we build it in my state or whatever. But it is an engine of American prosperity. Of course, this is not an endorsement of it. It's a terrible thing. And it also sort of requires the US to continually destabilize the rest of the world in order to make sure that there's a continued reason for us to be selling so much arms, both to our own military and then also to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, our biggest buyers of arms, some of the most evil governments in the world. So the European Union could do this successfully. I don't think they're moving in that direction, but it's plausible that they could set up something similar to the American industrial complex, and that this would be beneficial for Europeans. However, obviously this shouldn't be done. Like I'm all for a fiscal and a stimulus and reindustrializing Europe, but oh my God, to spend it on something else, spend it on almost anything else, but especially like renewable energy. Remember, people were talking about that a few years ago. That seems to no longer be on the table. Anyway, what do you think, Sam?
I'd have to agree, yeah. But I would just to further that point. You're talking about incredibly high value goods that the price tags on things that are going into the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. That produce a small number of highly specialized, highly qualified jobs. Like I'm not a specialist, but I would think in terms of industrial employment, probably in terms of just raw number of workers, the defense industry has to be like lower per dollar input. You've got to be creating less jobs than almost any kind of civilian industry, I would think.
Except maybe crypto and AI.
Yeah, it's just pure money pits, I guess. The second point, is that they would be dependent. You would have to find stable external markets. I mean, France has managed to, get some pretty sweet deals with the UAE, with Egypt, with India, selling the Rafale and everything. Can you do that on a European scale? Maybe. I mean, if you actually were able to create a common European defense market, presumably your unit price comes down and that becomes more appealing for export buyers. But that brings you to the third point of just imagine the horse trading. Like you mentioned individual congressmen being able to demand military pork barrel spending for their own constituencies. Like, boy, imagine that at the EU scale. And that's already been one of the major, like we talked about, stumbling blocks of countries don't want to compromise. They want to profit from increased military spending, but they don't want to, they're not interested necessarily if it's only helping a neighbor.
Beautiful, the U.S. military industrial complex is that horse trading is a key part of it and makes it work.
Yeah.
If all the spending was in California, that would break the American economic system. So the fact that it's spread out to Nebraska and Maine is a key part of it. So horse trading can be good.
So why is anyone going to buy in? No one's going to buy in here if it's all just to the benefit of France, Germany, and Italy. But then is the extreme level of that is, we have to have aircraft manufacturing plants in Lithuania. Well, now you're just completely strategically compromising your own, what's the end game here? How do you balance that out?
Yeah, and the key, what you said, I don't know if that's true about the employment per dollar spent. Probably it is, just also because there's so much graft in military contracting. You know what I mean? There's so much just it's got to be the least efficient way to spend money in terms of what you're actually getting. But also there's the classic economic point about spending money on arms and military and stuff like this, is that spending money on any other good, in theory, creates a rise in overall welfare, because if you're building a fridge, you're not just spending the money on the fridge and that's helping the economy. Also, someone's then using that fridge and that's increasing their welfare. And military spending is precisely the opposite of that, because they're things that decrease people's welfare, often in quite drastic ways. Yeah.
Right. And unlike after World War II, there's no reason to think that they're going to ramp up, fight a war, and then have a bunch of excess capacity, right? We're just talking about a relatively modest buildup compared to, we're not going to be spending 35% on GDP. I hope not on defense spending anytime soon.
If you want to really look at what the extreme consequences can be, you can look at what's going on in Russia, where there's been an enormous surge of military spending and an effort by the state to militarize civilian manufacturing, to reorganize industry, to create different industrial concentrations. And it's been destabilizing to the Russian economy in a fairly substantial way. There was I think it was a finance ministry white paper that was leaked to Le Monde a while ago. And it wrote that the massive reorientation of the Russian economy towards armaments has raised questions of sustainability. The resilience of the Russian economy is accompanied by a hypertrophy of the military-industrial complex to the detriment of all other sectors. The note highlighted the detrimental effects of inflation and Moscow's reduced investment in civilian industry and public services, including the power grid and transport. And elsewhere, you've seen it written that Russia has become now a gas station that also produces tanks. So effectively, every economic sector outside of fossil fuels and the arms industry is just atrophy. in a dramatic way. And what's interesting is some of what you see is that the sudden surge in defense spending is so inflationary that one of the subsidiaries of Rostec, the Russian state-owned armed firms, one of the subsidiaries that makes armored vehicles, reported a 45% increase in production costs, exceeding revenue, which is terrible if you're a shareholder. So, and what's interesting is this has also resulted in a complete brain drain from other sectors. There's been just a persistent gap in terms of qualified workers in the Russian economy. Basically, every engineer is being pulled into this. It's just leading to a death spiral in civilian manufacturing, which was not in a great state in Russia to begin with. So the Russian economy is now being hollowed out completely to put everything on a war footing.
I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, if you increase government spending overall, you get a Keynesian stimulus effect. But if you're doing it at these really high levels, you are just, you're not increasing capacity by that much. You are just diverting resources in the economy to do something that is, again, tremendously unproductive, lethal.
Right. And so quickly jump back to how much the EU claims they're willing to hold out in terms of debt-fueled military spending, increases of up to 6% of GDP that is not going to count against debt rules. Like, imagine what that does to an economy. Is it desirable for Poland to be spending 7 or 8% of their GDP on military spending? Even more if it's going to buying foreign goods. Just imagine.
Yeah, well, I think we've basically covered it there. And I would also highlight that this has all been hypothetical, and I don't think any of us are in favor of war with Russia / death spiral defense spending for Europe. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Sam, and enlightening us about this.
Always a pleasure. Love to ramble.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks all of you for listening. Till next time, this has been the Royal Palace.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.